the topic is deep activism, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Alex Jackimovicz, someone that I got to know back in 2012 when a number of Proutists, including he was very actively involved in putting together the Economic Democracy Conference in Madison, Wisconsin, which was, I think, kind of a milestone event in that kind of approach to addressing some of the prevailing challenges. And he has a long history of great activism, involvement in the community. He's a private business owner himself, successful business person, and has started a number of organizations and is active in a number of organizations, particularly in the upper New England part of the country, but is also active in many other capacities and currently serves on the steering committee for Prout Alliance. So Alex, I think we all look forward to hearing your presentation on a program that I think has been enjoying some real success, that you really are the creator and person that is providing that for interested people. So the floor is yours, Alex.
Well, thank you so much. It's really an honor and a pleasure to speak to everybody and to all those who may join on later and may listen to this later. I really appreciate the series of doing public seminars on topical issues related to progressive voter utilization theory, and this is certainly one of them. So I have a PowerPoint presentation and a very thorough list of notes. There's going to be some time for some interchange, and I'm not going to have opportunity to go into depth onto this issue, but we're going to talk about the whole scope of it, and we'll see where it takes us. My name is Alex Jackimovicz. I'm a co-founder of the Alliance for Economic Democracy, and one of the reasons I'm here today is to talk about a new theory and system I'm thinking of for activism. We're going to hear some of the scope of it, but not the whole thing, because it's actually too large to give in an hour or 2 or 5. So we're going to go kind of into an overview and talk about some very important points of it. So this is going to be called Foundations for a New Activism. I had to make some choices in the content. A choice of selecting a few critical topics and leaving out so much other content. Excuse me. I've also had to assume a certain level of interest and buy-in. So for instance, I'm going to take it for granted that there's an interest in what we would call system change, at least insofar as wanting to transform capitalism to be more people's needs centered, to be more people controlled, to transform economic and social institutions for the welfare of all beings in harmony with the needs of the planet. It's kind of a baseline set of assumptions I'm having here. So we're going to go into a little bit of a critique of conventional forms of activism which fall far short of engaging in the meaningful work of setting the stage for long-term changes in society. So this long-term, deeper activism, in part, is one that we're all going to be compelled to become engaged in and competent with sooner or later. Another assumption, and this might be maybe the most critical one for the evening because it's so different from what is the standard fare for what activism is thought of, what activists are engaged in, what is thought to be part of activism. I'm making an assumption that there's an importance of what I would call inner work, personal growth, character development as a value for individuals in activism. So the basic premise is that the inner work is foundational to the overall missions of activism, and I'm going to get heavily into that. So finally, for the system change work is vital, a necessary form of activism that has barely been expressed, and it is basically only at an exploratory stage of development, except for some very specific people's movements which have adopted some radical strategies. But for the most part, it's very, very little understood, and there's hardly anything going on with that. So those are some assumptions I'm going to have starting in here. John mentioned a little bit about me. Yes, I'm connected to the international movement for progressive utilization theory, propounded by Indian philosopher and activist PR Sarkar. So, yes, I'm an organizer, I'm an activist. I've done work with a variety of organizations here in Maine, in particular, a lot of work with the Maine People's Alliance, the Maine Small Business Coalition. I've worked with the Maine Fair Trade Campaign. I co-founded the Alliance for Economic Democracy with my partner, spouse, confidant, and system specialist, Sri Veril. So yes, I also work with Proutist across the country. I write on trade and economic justice, human rights issues, and especially about economic democracy. So in 2017, I co-founded the Alliance for Economic Democracy with Sri Veril. We're interested in systems change work, starting with a democratization of the economy, which is going to include, we hope, a mass increase in the cooperative industry sector to replace many aspects of the economy, which are the prerogative and design of private enterprise currently. So, we're already very much engaged and interested in this work, and we think in this direction. Within this desire for economic democracy, there's a reordering of how some basic functions of the economy that operate, such as a relocalization of industry, principles of subsidiarity, and if you don't know what subsidiarity is, we can talk about that at the end. So subsidiarity in terms of decision-making and other issues of decentralization, regional, local self-sufficiency, how major economic institutions in society are governed and controlled, who gets to control them. Areas such as the banking sector, energy sector, infrastructure, manufactured goods for essential needs. So we question the notion that major corporations are the best way or even a good way to meet needs of society, to meet needs in the modern age. And here's another fundamental premise we have. Dedication to this old system of having private entities driven by their personal profit and self-interest to make the critical decisions in society is leading us collectively down a dark path of unsustainable crises compounded on top of each other. So we're joining many other forward-thinking progressive people who believe we must fundamentally change the system to address pressing needs of the day. So economic democracy is offering a practical lens to begin this discussion, an expansion of what alternatives can and should look like. So economic democracy movement organizing is a relatively little-known area of advocacy for system change work, although it's becoming much more so, and stands as an example of necessary expansion of activism into other fields, representing this longer-term strategic vision. I kind of really dipped my feet in activist work back in 2011 and 2012. And a lot of it had to do first with organizing for Prout and economic democracy, and later on, a lot of local organizing. And in particular, I had so much interaction and interchange with people doing social and economic justice work. So I'm part of that crowd. And I learned everything that they're taught and how they operate. And it was transformative. The basic issue that I was facing with my own activism probably a decade ago or so was that I felt like I had this spiritual component to myself. I had a fundamental challenge of maintaining my own identity in relation to activist spaces. I had opportunity to offer something original, and I began to create workshops on something that I began to call deep activism, because I felt that there was an activism that included an inner work that had to be taken up by activists personally and collectively, done by them in general society, and that this component of personal development work had an equal value to the outer work that we associate with activism. So this is kind of a radical point of view, not very much appreciated, as a matter of fact. I made an observation that I felt that what a lot of social justice and traditional activist groups lack is a foundation for developing noble traits of character, really looking at our psychological makeup as individuals, our limitations, our real pressures, the influences that we have just as normal people, because so much of the activist spaces are engaged in, obviously, the work of trying to right some wrong, trying to do some particular task, trying to advocate. So this began a journey that is far outside the realm of what's considered activism as we know it. So I began to develop deep activism first in terms of presenting inner work as a complement to the outer work of activism. So outer work, what is outer work? Partially it's traditional activism, and here we're going to talk about how to vastly expand that as well into other dimensions of human life, beyond justice activities, beyond a lot of things. So the inner work has had a great effect on the work of activism, but it is left unsaid. Its presence or its lack of is highly impactful on the work of advocacy and the work of justice that we end up engaging in. So I found myself engaging more directly with what role this inner work may or may not have in organizing. How to present that in social, economic justice settings, in other areas of system change work. After all, I'm a Proutist and radical humanist. Doesn't the notion of inner work or personal growth of organizers seem secondary to the huge injustices, the inequities, the crises we face? And we're going to hear a little bit tonight about how, not so fast, this may be actually the pivotal component to begin to address those issues. I can't go too far without addressing this man. Sarkar has a relation to this work of the expansion of activism into something much more ambitious and much deeper. Much of the deep activism is inspired by his revolutionary holistic approach and his radical moral stance. I'm forever grateful. So, Sarkar had some really important contributions, and I'm going to break it up into 3 areas, into a triangle. He definitely emphasized inner work in terms of a spiritual base, and I'm not going to go a huge amount into this. And he also talked about objective adjustment, subjective approach, objective adjustment. But there's a third dimension that he began to develop, which is the integration of this third dimension. So Sarkar had 3 main spheres of contribution reflected in 3 spheres of human existence. The physical, material area, the psychic, intuitive, emotional, intellectual area, and something more ineffable and much more personal, a spiritual area. These are three areas of human existence, three areas of growth and movement, personal and collective movement and growth. Sarkar developed the theory of progressive utilization, Prout, as a new vision for a sociological ordering of society based in ethics, collective needs, the full realization and the harmonious realization of potentials. So Prout is primarily concerned with the realm of human beings and how to effectively manage this world, how to best shape human society, human economies. His social theories and his practical organizational sense, for instance, of Samaj movement building, looking at the benevolent welfare and all-around progress of human beings in relation to each other and to non-human beings on the planet. This is a big contribution to how to manage this physical existence we all have and how to manage human society, and it has profound implications. The other side, which is much more easier to talk about than the third side in activist spaces, is neo-humanism, a universal sense of humanism, not just applied to human beings, but applied to non-human entities and even the inanimate worlds. So neo-humanism is a significant aspect of mental, psychic, emotional level, on the level of the intellect, on the level of psychic existence. The premise is basically twofold in terms of activism. Establishing a universal sense of family with all beings, especially human beings, incorporating a sense of responsibility, ethics, and recognition of the fundamental intrinsic value of all beings and not just their utility value to human beings. So neo-humanism is almost something like a midway point or integration of the inner expansion of heart and being found in spirituality. And I'm just going to briefly only say this about spirituality. The thirst and urge for limitlessness and uniting to that which is beyond our individual sense of self. So neo-humanism and spirituality are associated with this expansion. The other side of neo-humanism is the all-around struggle for justice, the basic dignities of all, a relentless and energetic fight against all exploitation. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of explaining the concepts and values coming from spirituality in an activist context, except insofar as to posit an assumption that spiritual development is manifested and known. It is recognizable in an expanded heart, a service-mindedness for the welfare of others, a vastly expanded sense of caring connected to sense of self. These are the relevant traits to activism and not some belief system. It's not a matter of believing something. So my thought with this contribution on Triangle of Growth is that we can apply these same ideas of various spheres of human growth and development to the world of activism. And that's kind of, in a nutshell, the basis for much of my thinking on deep activism. So I'm going to make a few observations here before I even get into the material. Keeping in mind these three spheres of human existence and development, we observe that what most of us refer to as activism is a focus on the material world only. usually on addressing specific sets of injustices. We can see that most of activism neglects the importance of centering a fair amount of the emotional and other inner development and growth because it's focused in material realities and concerns. With deep activism, it's my view and opinion that we must equally prioritize self-development of individuals as the cornerstone for developing a more humane, neo-humanistically founded society. Further, that the success of our activism to change the material world, the outer work, depends on making progress in transforming individual and collective psychology outside of traditional justice-based activism. In relation to Prout, the Prout Society doesn't come into being without this work being done. So going further into the material outer work of activism, revolutionary system changes are required to meet modern human society's needs. Without the work toward long-term solutions involving system change movements in activism, we cannot address the great crises, the great problems of the day. We cannot gain traction in this area without pushing forward with great zeal and energy to show the world practical, people-based, environmentally sustainable alternative solutions. Another world is possible. To get there, the inner work is essential, indispensable, inevitable. So a few comments on inner work. On the one hand, we have the outer work of changing policy, fighting racism, fighting against the exploitation of women, all kinds of issues, struggling to get basic people's needs met. All this is extremely important, and that's the outer work. There is a radical idea to incorporate a mission of inner and personal development work, including a system of discipline, morality, ethics, infused into the character of those doing activism work as an equal part in importance to the overall mission. The idea is that we're interested in developing and creating leaders of integrity, ethical conscience, having a service-minded mentality, energetically engaged in work for the benevolent welfare of all beings. So the personal work that's encouraged in contemporary activist spaces, in most social justice settings, for instance, is nowadays emphasizing diversity, equity, inclusion, among other practical skills in advocacy and activism. Organizing for social justice prioritizes the idea that marginal voices must be heard and prioritized, and that these voices must be the leaders in movements of reform. So I'm just going to point that out. So there's an ideological approach in activist spaces, and not so much a character building approach necessarily, although it can definitely lead in that direction, hopefully. You know, what is the practical use of saying all this inner work? What's the actual value? What's the practical relevance for activist movements? So self-development or training of ethical character has been ignored in favor of ideological training and social justice imperatives and agendas. the emphasis isn't necessarily on producing good people and character building integrity, at least not accountability. The ideology is good. The ideology is well intentioned, but it's a very ideological approach. It's not so much necessarily about all around personal development. What really is the relevance of this personal development work and worthy leadership building to these activist movements? I have an example that involves a man named Gustavo Speth, and I'm going to describe who he is before I give the example. Gus Speth, or Gustavo Speth, is a prominent environmental lawyer with decades spent in the trenches addressing global environmental issues. So Speth worked for years as the ultimate insider, working at the United Nations with their developmental program, their developmental group. He was senior advisor on environmental issues to Presidents Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton. He grew disillusioned with the limited impact he was able to have reforming the system, even as perhaps one of the most powerful progressive insiders working with key scientists and environmental advocates for critical legislation and policy initiatives which are required to responsibly address our modern environmental and climate crises. He became a staunch advocate for system change later on, and he helped to found something called the Next System Project, which is an offshoot of a really good organization called the Democracy Collaborative. And they might as well could have called themselves the Economic Democracy Collaborative, because that's the work they do. To put things in perspective, that the work toward reform that is focused on the material details, as if getting the right information to support the right policy is the work. And he said something like this: I used to think that top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address these problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual revolution, and we lawyers and scientists don't know how to do that. I'm going to make a quick point here, and then we're going to come back to this point in a second. When activism is only focused on getting the right message to decision makers, or just changing the worst form of capitalism to something slightly less destructive, it is caught within silos of strategic thinking. The silos of what I've come to think of as shallow reformist thinking. A fundamental crisis such as ecosystems collapse and the concurrent climate change can't be adequately addressed without it can't be adequately addressed by only looking at policy. So how can specific issue organizing possibly address issues such as societal greed, apathy, selfishness, self-interest? What to say of the failure and hypocrisy of leadership, or the inability of leaders to honestly examine and communicate about pressing issues? Why are the great climate and environmental movements of our age only finding fleeting and momentary successes, when the huge mass of the public worldwide is aware of the issues and the urgency, let alone this scientific establishment? Can it be because the activism is small reform based within the capitalist system, which is highly resistant to outside meddling, by the general public, that can get in the way of the order of things that decisions in this system come from on high, usually from corporate firms instructing leaders how to think about and resolve issues that the public and the scientific community is clamoring about. I'm reminded of this old 100-year-old image from 1911. This is the plight of the industrial worker. Who's this system really about? How's it controlled? Who does the work and who gets the benefits? So perhaps it's because the people doing the advocacy and the general public who support this advocacy have no voice in the decision-making processes, that government is largely insulated from public outcry and desires, even within so-called political democracies. I have some graphics that I created. They're original. Bear with me. I'm going to explain them a little bit. We're going to have a way to think about a complex set of issues. And in a moment, I'm going to describe a triangle of capitalism and how it operates. So on one side of the triangle, you have who, or the identity of the people who are designing the system to reflect their interests. On another side, you have the why, or their ideological approach. Why are they doing things? What is it that they're trying to get? And then on a third side, you have the physical manifestation of how it's happening, the actual mechanism of this system. So I'm going to apply this triangle, this relational set of triangles, to capitalism. You can see kind of a quick, simple, slightly cynical breakdown of what capitalism is, but we can argue this point. The idea is that there's a breakdown in modern systems of governing of the global capitalist economy, not only at odds with human needs, but the planet's limited resources, the planet's limited ability to sustain human-derived damage. Overall, there's a failure of modern systems to deliver policies and a modern economy based on the needs of people living in harmony with the planet, in harmony with the needs of each other. So the work of establishing viable alternatives and the mobilization to put those alternatives in place to replace a dying system, to finally address the many crises, is our work for systems change. This work is largely absent from any kind of thinking that goes into the regular engagement of conventional activism. So activism tends to be siloed into specific issues and affiliations, and by their nature focused on concentrated targets, which leave alone the orthodoxies of power. So they're embedded with a reform strategy and not systemic change works. Oh my God, why can't we influence the system? We have all the data. I want to point out the triangle of reform environmental activism. And where does it fit within this triangle of capitalism? Well, it is not trying to change who is benefiting from the system or who the system is about. It is not challenging the concentration of wealth and the maximizing of profits, which is the ideology, which is the intent of the whole system. It's not trying to alter free markets or large corporations from their domination over the landscape. It's trying to do a little bit of environmental reforms in that landscape, and it's running into roadblocks. The reform strategy of the environmental movement is working towards specific goals without addressing the system which is producing the crises, the failed, unaccountable, self-interested leadership. It's focused on specific work only, and we can't really blame them. The point being that solutions are presented from within the system which caused them. We get caught up in the silos of organizing again, and it's our challenge and responsibility to move past reforms and to engage in transformative work, to really get down into these issues. So how do we begin to address the existential issues that Speth raises? The failure of leadership, apathy, fragmentation, greed, selfishness, which lie at the root of our social, economic, and political ills. My thought is that there has to be an evolution in consciousness that includes revolutionary training, ideological training, multifaceted opportunities to become established in various forms of activism, research, leadership, organizing, logistics, planning, and most importantly, direct community service. So this is the character building, the conscience arousing, identity expanding work. So this is the inner work that could be included and has a real value in changing the system. When we begin to challenge the notion that maximizing profits is how we should be thinking about designing our economy. And also that the people who gain most of the benefits and make nearly all the decisions in the economy are a very select small group, and they're mostly self-interested. So we'd like to reorient activist spaces to be a bit less identity politic based in organizing, identity politics based activism, and more toward varied forms of direct community service based on the necessity of meeting people's needs, starting with where they are hurting and they are deprived in our local communities. And here we touch upon a very basic premise within progressive utilization theory. That the real work is looking at the needs, the actual needs, not just the injustices and the exploitation, addressing those as well, but the all-around needs, the potentials of society, making a plan to meet those needs collectively, carrying out those plans. Beyond the rectifying of exploitation and inequities and meeting basic needs, activism should be venturing into new realms such as looking at the progressive utilization of the potentials of all people, of the environment in addressing local needs. In other words, we should be laying some of the groundwork for Prout, for Samaj building, in addition to addressing the immediate justice issues. In my case, expanding the work beyond just economic democracy organizing, which is really what I'm very interested in, but raising minimum wage, good salaries, and work for all those who want it, pro-cooperatives, pro-energy democracy. I'm interested in feeding the poor, but we can also do other work. We can be multifaceted. We don't have to focus on a specific issue. We don't have to have organizations designed to have deliverables which only focus on one tiny thing at a time via a philanthropic industrial complex. Anyway, I see activist organizations in the future not solely organized on their preferential topic only, but also engaged within the greater networks within their community to support their community, not just with one tiny specific, and I don't want to say tiny, but one single issue, and that they do work that allows community members to become engaged with the overall work of selfless action for others, for the welfare of other beings. So, vastly expanding traditional ideas of activism in addressing collective needs. So, our desire is to transform activist spaces to incorporate in their missions personal, ethical work, neo-humanistic ideology, to create compassionate, empathetic, responsible people working for the betterment of other beings, to offer the practical example of what this looks like, what impact this has in localities and communities, to offer these new leaders opportunities for all-around development. Activism should find ways of motivating and engaging the greater body of interest in community care and responsibility, community connection, relationship building with people. We should be focused in such a way that our work leads to unified communities, to connection, to relation, symbiotic relation. We can have this expansion into the all-around development and needs of communities, as well as long-term strategies such as system change work. So both of these aspects are expanding the notion of what I'm calling outer work of activism. So to do this kind of thing, this expansion requires a deep awareness of the real actual needs of the community and in coordination with others engaged in meaningful community service work. It requires a level of organization and people inspired to do this work. I hope you see the connection for those of you who are familiar with Prout. Full utilization of local potentials to meet local needs. Does that not sound like Prout? This can be a major primary mission of activism itself and activist work and what people are doing, and this should be. I want to mention a little hint of other topics that I just cannot possibly get to. And one of them is the work of Martin Luther King. Towards the end, he began to expand his interest in activism beyond anti-racist work. He began to see interrelations of the anti-racist work into other fields that were not explicitly anti-racism. Martin Luther King Jr. had a recognition that the work of anti-racism involved a greater work of acknowledging and beginning to organize to address poverty, militarism, materialism. And I'm adding a fifth one to this, and I'm calling these crises, not just issues. The fifth one is ecosystems collapse. These are crises that some of activism is engaged in addressing. These are some of the really big ones, the problems of the day, which our society as a whole has to address, but they aren't being adequately and responsibly engaged by leaders, by our politics, by our economies. The activist movements have had some noteworthy but limited successes. one of the observations that we can make when this deep activism approach is that the grand movements of activism have largely failed to make substantial progress in decades on those issues. There have been some reforms that may curb outrage against the system and divert activist energy. But it's part of our imperative as organizers who want to see a more humane, rational, sane world to understand the extent of the problems as well as how they're understood or misunderstood, what actions are being taken and why, what actions are not being taken and why. So Martin Luther King acknowledged a set of related issues that I consider as crises, in particular as his activism matured beyond that. The anti-racism work was a symptom of a greater sense of a series of diseases in society, that there were other symptoms that were equally as important. As he showed this maturity of understanding activism, he realized that he and the greater civil rights movement as a whole were addressing issues that were part of an ecosystem of issues beyond the suppression of rights of people of color and removing the worst of the immediate denial of those necessary human rights. These other issues are seemingly embedded within each other. They're not, in fact, really separate, even though our activism compartmentalizes them. We focus on specific issues while not engaging in significant coordination in addressing other issues. This has led to an activism of limited successes, which hasn't been able to get at root causes and deep changes required for solutions. I wanted to mention that. Our time is fading. I'm going to just mention a couple more things that are pretty important to the deep activist approach. NIA. What is NIA? NIA is an acronym. Neo-humanistic ethics, education, application. What sets deep activism apart, really, and what gets us to develop all sides of the human triangle as applied to activist work is this neo-humanistic approach. There's a necessity for system change to address growing crises in the modern age. Modern human beings' collective psychology and leadership have deteriorated to the point of fragmentation, self-interest, apathy, indulgence, short-sightedness. We're coming upon a transitional moment in collective human history where we have to organize effectively for a different, more humane, more sustainable world, or deal with catastrophic consequences. So this neo-humanistic work, this NIA, which I really can't say too much about given the time constraints, it means very little in the absence of the practical work, including both the long-term and short-term strategies. System change in addition to addressing the short-term goals that we have to face. The challenge is to transform activist organizations to do both. So it includes an intersection of the practical work of reforming the material world to match the new values, new ethics, and new relationships, as well as the inner work within people in society, within the organizers, to make this work fruitful, to change the minds of people, to inspire, to trigger the empathy, the sympathy parts of their brains. In this perspective, all of conventional justice-based activism falls within just one section of the neo-humanistic work of fighting against injustices, corruption, exploitation, and inequities. So everything that we practically consider activism, falls within this part of the activism of Nia. So that's one aspect of this work. We see that with deep activism, the greater vision for activism falls in all three spheres of the growth triangle for society, advocating and for doing this expanded role of activism, rendering service work that's not only on the physical level, intellectual, emotional, educational, as well as spiritual. What does that mean? It means bringing the human family together. The justice work, as was pointed out in the Occupy movement by none other than Cornel West, justice is what love looks like in public. Lessening divisions, forging bonds. So the real work of activism is more than a tinkering with specific policies. It's the revolution of values, ideals, ethics, a sense of personal responsibility throughout society. It includes establishing a sense of responsibility and discipline within society, to have it be the expectation that people will live up to certain criteria of individual integrity. This is for ordinary people in society. We don't get to have the world we want unless a mass collective psychology movement becomes a part of the mission of our activism. We want a society where it is the norm and expected norm to be a good person, to have a sense of responsibility and connection with others. So activism is rooted in humanism, neo-humanism, in forming a universal family in harmony with other beings, creating a sense of community, a sense of responsibility, a sense of kinship and connection with all. So that is a big piece of this activism.
Alex, I want to interject. We're at the hour at this point. I think if you are willing to continue, and
I
others
have just like
wishes,
another 5 minutes and my content's over.
Okay.
I can talk. I think we
Sounds
started
good.
10 minutes late. What I'm trying to hint at here is that this work is laying the groundwork for a prouder society. It's foundational work to prepare for new psychology. And it's an all-around effort in many fields, some scientific, some educational, some relating to justice advocacy, others to new forms of economic institutions, new forms of governing, new forms of decision-making. Activism is vastly expanded to include the inner development of individuals in collective society, the effort to encourage them and even facilitate those norms as the new norms in society. This is what Sarkar has called a nuclear change, a nuclear revolution, an all-around revolution in society, from the various institutions and formations of nation states down to how towns, villages, regions relate and collaborate with each other, how our economies function. It is system change work. It is personal work. It is environmental activism. It is justice activism. It is the creation of service-mindedness among all levels of leaders in society. So this nuclear revolution includes a shift in values, a shift in social responsibilities, a shift in social relations and connections. All of this is part of the scope of deep activism. So I just have this one last concluding thought. I didn't create this. This is a fleshing out that so many people from diverse backgrounds and talents have begun to take up. And this is my fleshing out of Sarkar's ideas as they relate to activism. So this greater work for the progressive utilization of potentials in society, this Prout movement, and this deep activism is a heralding call to orient our expectations and our activism to be aligned toward nuclear revolution. So this activism that will help bring about this revolution is largely aspirational for the moment. Nonetheless, it's necessary and an inevitable radical movement that it's almost beyond the imagination of great thinkers for revolutionary change. Yet, it is one which PR Sarkar and the Prout movement are predicated upon. A vision for the future of what can be, what should be, and how to begin to get us there. Now, if I can figure out how to stop sharing, I'm going to be happy. I can't figure it out. Stop share. Oh, let's try that button. There we go.
Outstanding presentation. If people have questions, if you want to raise your hand, we can, or I don't think we had any questions in the chat. Just one person had to leave a little bit early, but thank you for the presentation. If people prefer to put something in the chat, please do so. A couple of us will watch for that, or Alex will be able to see it at this point.
It's nice to see you all. For those of you I can see. Hello, Didi.
Hi, namaskar.
Namaskar.
Okay, I have a comment, if I may.
Please.
This I'd call this meshing of service and what do you call sorry, thoughts not coherent right now. This message of activism and politics and change and service. All of this has already been plotted out by Baba through Ananda Marga. Virtually all of the departments within Ananda Marga's structure are only directed towards putting a face, a service face, to activism in the Prout phase. The two are completely connected. So to get from philosophy of activism to action of activism, then I think the next step has to be that people have to commit to start to engage in the community. Otherwise, we just remain here as a nice seminar that we turn off later on. And there's small ways of doing that. It doesn't have to be giant projects either.
Thank you for that comment. I totally agree. Absolutely agree. None of this means anything unless we get off our seats and we do something practical in our communities. We get engaged in direct service. I have a few too many interests. I have to take some time to figure out what should I be doing. But there's tons to do to just get involved in doing that work. One of the challenges that we face in doing this work is that when we do community service work, primarily we're acting as individuals in Western societies. We are taught to think that we're isolated and that we should organize in isolated ways. We aren't taught to think that we should be acting collectively. We shouldn't be actively looking at everybody's needs and collectively deciding. So there's this individual approach of engaging in community work, but outside of the departments of Ananda Marga, there's a lot of work to be done as well. And to integrate kind of this radical notion that we're trying to engage those people who would normally not be engaged, who don't have interest, that they are made to become aware and inspired by issues and by action. I think we have to create revolutionary service organizations engaged in multifaceted types of activism. My version of doing this is the creation of the Alliance for Economic Democracy in Maine. Go ahead, Mark.
I agree with Dee Dee that we need to get out into the community and engage the community. I've been experimenting a little bit with this in this little community of Silver City. There's a very active permaculture group. The mailing list is almost 100 people. So I've been in discussions that happen on the mail list, and when I hosted the permaculture meeting, introducing concepts of Prout, haven't been using the word Prout, and actually had a Proutist from Eugene, Jason Schreiner, give a presentation at the last meeting on how to link community resources together in the face of, he didn't use the term collapse of capitalism, but that's where he was pointing towards. And the group got very involved in it. In fact, in the subsequent meeting, that was the topic of how do we take inventory of all the food. What if the ability to get groceries and food to Silver City was disrupted? What if the transportation of food went kaput? What could we do in the permaculture movement to connect with others who grow food, who distribute food, et cetera, to get it out to a wider group? So I think that becoming involved in other community organizations and inserting some of our thinking one idea at a time. At the same time, I'm learning about how these people think and organize and where they go with it. And we have a few organizations. One is to protect the Gila watershed and the wilderness area. And that might be my next target, is to join them, come to the meetings, and figure out how do we, I'm gonna use the term infiltrate Proutist ideas. And when I do that, I'm kind of casting back to back in the past, how were the socialists in this country so successful in infiltrating the US, where even Eastern Montana, there was a county or two that literally had an elected socialist government. How did they infiltrate the ideas? How did they get people to realize what they were presenting meant something to them? So I'm in the investigation phase of how we steep these ideas in.
Do you remember, some of you, the Black Panthers of the 1960s? And some not.
Yes, we do.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so that was, to me, that was the very much the American model, as far as the examples that Alex was bringing up.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, I wasn't able to go into a lot of detail or to give a lot of practical examples, because my next example that I'm going to give For instance, I'm giving I'm leading a series of discussions in kind of a study circle called Deep Activism for Proutists, and it's going to be a survey of 4 main topics over 25 one-hour sessions. And we're going to be able to survey about 4 or 5 hours on each topic, but we're even only touching the surface. My next major topic is given an example of deep ecology approach that came out of kind of a Western philosophy and philosopher. It's a philosophy and a movement coined by Arne Naess, a Norwegian linguist and philosopher. And he had a contrast toward changing the values of the system and showing that there was a shallow level of activism related to environmental work. And there was a long-term strategic movement of activism. And he describes it as a multifaceted approach, and they're engaged in a wide variety of activist approaches. So not just looking at the work of conservation, which is how a lot of environmental activism started out as kind of a colonial project, maintaining spaces of empty wilderness. Anyway, we can go on and on into some of these issues, depending on the issue. I think community organizing and integrating with local organizations is key. And some practical examples of how to do that. Well, we all have our own kind of doorway into local activism. For some people, it may be regenerative agriculture, or it may be permaculture, or it may be local food systems. It may be the cooperative development of some of the local economies in the state. For instance, food, textiles, other things. People have their different entry points. And I think, the first step is going to be becoming part of those organizations. But I think we also have to maintain a stance of having our own identity and our own direction. And that means creating our own organizations that have our collective mission built within the organization. And I find that lacking in most nonprofit organizations, which are reliant on grant funding and deliverables, providing deliverables to progressive foundations, for instance, where they're only allowed to do a certain amount of very specific work. To get outside of that model, that's a big challenge. We have another question.
Yes, Steve.
Yes, I'm sorry, I was late. I had a conflict. But did you ever show a triangle that was similar to the one you showed about capitalism, but was about Prout? Because
Yeah, you want to see it?
Yes, I would. I mean, I assume that's very interesting. It's, you know, the benefits are the family of humankind, and the goal is maximum material.
Well, I don't have it in this slide. There is a Prout triangle. You
Yes.
don't get it for this presentation.
And then presumably the method is progressive utilization. It says that one gives the most resources to a person who can help the most people. Isn't that sort of the basis of Prout?
Yes, I think that Prout is trying to make sense to have the maximum utilization, the most rational distribution of those resources. And so the theory that you're referring to is that in Prout, there should be extra incentives to do extra social good, extra community impact, that should be rewarded socially. And that in our society, for instance, with capitalism, we have antisocial behavior being rewarded with billions of dollars. So that's a big contrast with Prout. So yes.
The example I remember is that the idea is if everyone has walks, well, then you might give a doctor a car because he can travel around more and help more people. And the idea again that the people benefiting are the family of humankind, the result of it is going to be the material security of humankind. And the method is progressive utilization. Maybe that's not what you had in your triangle, but that was what occurred to me.
I have not gone into the specifics of what local organizing and local mobilization looks like. So Sarkar has a number of ideas on that. They're rooted in what he calls Samaj building or Samaj movements. They're beyond the scope of what I want to talk about. Those are more specific to Prout theory. And I want to really get activist organizations to get outside of the boxes that they are in and to become aware of alternatives to how they are organizing themselves, to how a lot of what they're doing is having very limited success. And I want to point out some of the reasoning, but we should have practical examples of the direct community service that's very Prout inspired. And, you know, the departments of Ananda Marga, just as Didi was saying, these are the woman making the man making mission. The character building is within the work itself. The selfless work is the character building. This can be a model that can be applied to how justice-based activism is happening and how even activism, if we really twist their arms, even other stuff like alternative economy activism, the cooperative movement activism. It's very hard for those folks to think outside of their kind of affiliation of interests and assumptions. And I find that developing some of the ideas of Prout in new ways is very useful rather than trying to offer up a prescription that seems to have all the answers and is met with a lot of skepticism.
Your example of the environmental
Steve,
movement.
Steve, could I interrupt? I think Jennifer had a question also. Then we could come back to you.
And also, I'm sorry, I have to go.
Thank you for joining.
Yeah, Jennifer, did you have a question?
Yes, well, first of all, I wanted to know, is everyone here on the, that I'm seeing the names, are we all Margies or are there people who are not Margies attending, in attendance? Because my question is really related organizationally. So are we all Margies?
No.
No, okay. Well, I won't ask my question, but I apologize for coming late. I think there was a mix-up with the time. I'm actually calling you from Jamaica. I'm Ganga, by the way. Namaskar to the
Namaskar,
Margis.
Ganga. Aradhana, are you the author of The Earth Belongs to All? Are you that, Aradhana? Maybe she can't hear me. Anyway.
Well, Steve, did you have another question or comment you wanted to share?
Just a comment that I thought that it was a very graphic illustration of how the environmental movement, if it tries to change only one triangle but doesn't change the people that benefit and the goal of the system, it just doesn't work. It's the wealthy or the professional managerial class that is the one that is calling the tune and being influenced to run society.
Are you seeing anything? I don't know.
I saw one for a second.
So, is that what you're referring to?
Yes. What does a triangle look like for Prout?
So, I need to go back several slides. You missed something in the beginning, which referred to the contributions of PR Sarkar. And he had he had a vision of development or human beings having existence in a material existence, an outer existence, and he had a philosophy of Prout. He had a psychic level, which is an integration between the inner and the outer, and then a spiritual level. So this is not, I'm not actually giving a Prout presentation, but I wanted to give a, per se anyway, I think all of my material is Proutist, if not actually expanding Prout theory with his explicit kind of language. The notion here is that Sarkar repeatedly says the basis of the Prout society is spirituality. And actually, he jumps further down that. He doubles down. He says that the basis of morality itself is that morality itself is fleeting unless it has a spiritual base. So this, when activism, in my view, is properly expressed, there's a dynamic balance between inner development, the psychic balance, and the actual action out in the world. The actual action out in the world is what we'd call Proutistic type of endeavors. The psychic balance, how that gets expressed, is in our psychology of having an expanded sense of self and connection with other beings, our interest in developing a universal human family on the one side, and then the strength and the energy to fight against all exploitations on the other. So this is all kind of one unit. So I wasn't giving a triangle on how the Prout system works, although eventually I am going to be giving one. And I've actually done that when I had a previous iteration of study circles a couple of years ago. I created a Prout triangle, which explains the theory. So there's a deep activism triangle. There's shallow activism triangles. I was trying to show the triangle of reform environmental activism and why it's kind of destined for hitting its head against the wall. And that's kind of the basis of it.
Thank you for showing me that.
Honey.
Wonderful presentation. Just brilliant.
Thanks.
I really appreciate on the practical application how the triangles translate into my work as an environmental practitioner working to rationally distribute resources, working towards adaptation of ecosystem collapse in climate change work I do, and how clearly the silo of our technical expertise as practitioners no longer makes sense for us to leave behind or leave aside or set aside our spiritual and moral selves as we interact with each other and the subject matter. And the triangle just makes it so clear. It's like, you know, we are not beholden to the EPA, NOAA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, DEP, the regulatory agencies that are governing our, environmental regulations as we work. We work within an economy. We work with people who are affected, and we ourselves are affected. And many of the people that I work with are not receiving a livable wage. They don't have their basic needs met, but they are tasked with creating DEIJ statements to put on a website so that EPA and NOAA can check their box and say that they have addressed these issues. So I'm thinking about how to use that triangle in a listening session that I will be leading with a regional planning commission and National Estuary Preserve and actually several national estuary preserves, as we're considering how to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge and place-based knowledge as we're creating technical advice for nature-based solutions. A lot of words, but Thank you.
Thank you. Tapan. Nice to see you.
I wanted to mention that the sides of a triangle, it is important that all three sides of the triangle sort of remains in balance with each other.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, the equilibrium will be disrupted. I think that's the observation I made.
That is a major point. And let me give a specific example. I mentioned only briefly the so-called developmental work that goes into social justice spaces. And that's primarily around the centering of marginalized voices and what they call DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion work. And there's this notion that if you take, let's go back to this triangle here for a second. If you take this this growth triangle, and you put one side out of whack, what happens? So let's say, for instance, that ideology in the activist space is overemphasized. The ideology in this side is the psychic balance approach. So less work. So work is being taken away, for instance, from the material changes that have to happen in society. So one thing that we find, and I call it later on, we're going to talk about this in our affinity group, there's a shallow type of activism associated with all sorts of things. And there's a shallow anti-racist work, an anti-racist work that gets a little bit lost in ideology, and it gets less concerned with changing the material circumstances of exploitation and injustice. So getting back to the point that you were just making, Tapan, it does matter. It really matters to have a harmonious development in how we apply our overall activist work. So anyway, thank you for sharing that.
Thank
you. Yeah.
And thank you very much for an inspiring and very well done presentation.
Thank you.